Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. Please use the hashtag GLReading or Learning Tuesdays to tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's conversation, and we'll be sure to retweet. We strongly encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. So once again, on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, today's grade level reading campaign Learning Tuesdays webinar. It is called Flattening the Curve on Learning Loss, State Considerations and Strategies. And my name's Emily Samos, and I'm a consultant for the campaign. And I'm stepping in to manage a few of our sessions in this online learning series, particularly focused on the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge. And before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few of the quick housekeeping details as you see on the screen. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to use the chat box to introduce yourself, sharing your name, your organization, and your city or your GLR campaign coalition. And when you do, please be sure to select all panelists and attendees before you click return so that everyone can know who's with us today. And then, as you probably know from other webinars, all webinar attendees today will be in listen-only mode during the presentations to avoid any background noise and distractions. But we welcome you to post any questions that you may have during the presentation in the Q&A box. So as you all know from Zoom, there's the chat box and then there's the Q&A box. And we ask you, if you have a specific question, whether it's for the entire panel or a specific panelist, to please put that in the Q&A. It helps us manage things a little bit better. And want to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to all folks who registered in a follow-up email that will go out later this week. And then also wanted to give you a heads up that we'll be posting a brief survey, like a quick poll towards the end of the webinar, and we really encourage you to, we want to capture your feedback, and we really encourage you to just take a few minutes. It'll take, probably less than a minute actually to complete that. So keep your eye out for that as we kind of wrap up the webinar within the next hour and a half. So just first, I'd like to share just a little bit of background about Learning Tuesdays. As you can see on the screen, we've had a number of great sessions planned. We still have a number of great sessions planned for the coming weeks, and we've been doing this since September. These are every Tuesday at 3 p.m., and it's sort of a predictable and reliable schedule for you all to be able to participate in these really robust series of learning opportunities. And since September, there's now been over 40 webinars, and we encourage you to visit CLIP, the campaign's community. It's called the Campaign's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, and I'll post the link in a second, to find the growing archive of resources from these online conversations. There's a lot in there. They are exploring the best science, ideas, programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. And then also we're happy to say that the resources on CLIP, these Learning Tuesday resources in particular, were recently reorganized. So it's actually super easy to navigate and find the exact session that you're looking for and the content that you're looking for. And if you're unfamiliar with CLIP, I'm gonna get the link and get it posted for you so you can go ahead and get registered in CLIP as soon as possible. Okay, so for today's conversation, this whole month, the month of June, even a little before, we started in late May, we've engaged in what's called the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge series, lifting up the issue of learning loss to acknowledge and confront the very real threat presented by the COVID-19 slide. So we're looking at 6 months total, if not more, of no school. Today, we have this really exciting opportunity to hear from executives of sector-leading organizations who are representing state legislators, chief state school officers, district superintendents, rural education leaders. So, you know, kind of representing these big groups, networks of these local leaders, state leaders, and they're going to discuss the strategies being considered by these leaders to mitigate learning loss as we sort of think through and approach the fall and what the re-entry to school, return to school might look like. And first, I have the pleasure of introducing our amazing moderator, Barbara O'Brien. Barbara is the former Lieutenant Governor of Colorado, and she's the current member at large of the Denver Public Schools Board of Education, where she's served since 2017. She was previously the president of the Colorado Children's Campaign for 16 years. And I would like to say, most importantly, we are lucky to have had her as a senior fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading since the very beginning, and she serves as policy director. So now I get to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Barbara O'Brien, to introduce the rest of our amazing panel today. Barbara, I turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. And I just want to remind everyone that we know almost every level of education in this country had to change almost overnight to respond to the pandemic. And what we're focused on is the emerging evidence that, not surprisingly, the greatest impact of learning loss is probably going to be on our most vulnerable young students. So we're meeting here today to have a conversation about the innovative things that states and districts are doing to make sure that as we all restart in the fall, that we're making sure that the children most hit by this change, the change in relationships, the change in instruction, everything, will have the attention of some of our strongest leaders to make sure they have a chance to recover their learning loss. So it's my honor to introduce the panel. We have Jeremy Anderson, the president of the Education Commission of the States, a national education policy organization that serves as a partner to state policymakers. In his role, Jeremy works with all state education leaders, from governors to chief state school officers, to provide unbiased information, personalized support, and opportunities for collaboration. Dr. Rolf Grafwallner is Program Director of Early Childhood Initiatives at the Council of Chief State School Officers in Washington, D.C. He works with states to improve learning opportunities and outcomes for young children. He was previously an assistant state superintendent in Maryland and has been a teacher, program director, and administrator. Dr. Alan Pratt is the executive director of the National Rural Education Association. Throughout his career, he has served as a high school science teacher and coach, high school principal, and assistant superintendent / curriculum director. And I have to say, having attended a rural set of schools, I understand the multitasking that Dr. Pratt has done. His work is focused on issues that impact rural schools and the role of instructional leaders at the district and school levels. Dr. Valerie Truesdale joined AASA, the Superintendent's Association, as Assistant Executive Director in 2019. Valerie previously led technology and transformation for Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools for over 6 years, growing personalized learning for CMS's 151,000 students. Valerie also previously served as superintendent of schools for 10 years in 2 counties in South Carolina. Our commentator today will be Preston Castille. Preston Castille is the District 8 member of the Louisiana Board of Elementary and Secondary Education and chairs the board's School of Innovation and Turnaround Committee. Preston recently retired after 25 years practicing law with the Taylor Porter Law Firm, where he was a partner and member of the firm's executive committee. He currently teaches education law and policy at the Southern University Law Center and is president of Helix Community Schools. So thank you all for joining us today. Jeremy, I'm going to start with you. In your work to track education-related state policies for Education Commission of the States, how many states and how are the states transitioning from a response mode to a rebuilding mode in the fall?
Thank you so much, Barbara. That's a great question. I think we're seeing states doing a lot of very innovative things across the country, but I would say most of the states are still in a response mode, and I think that response mode is going to continue into the fall. There are so many changes in policies that they're trying to deal with, from teacher licensure to how many students can be in the classroom to how do they get some of the teacher curriculum ready for online if they need it, that we don't really think we're going to see a lot of states getting to a rebuilding stage, probably until they've started school and into probably fourth quarter of 2020. But that doesn't mean there aren't some good policies out there. So I want to start a little bit by talking about who we are so you can understand what I'm going to share with you. And we really view ourselves as an essential and indispensable member of any team addressing education policy. We have a staff of 60, we're unbiased, bipartisan, we just look at the research to help elected officials know how to create better policies. What we do is we truly believe in the power of learning from experience, and we know that informed policymakers create better education policy. And I say that because when you look at our membership, we have over 350 commissioners from across the country. In most states, my 7 commissioners are the governor of the state, the chief state school officer in charge of K-12, the chair of the state legislature's Senate Education, the chair of the state legislature's House Education, usually a university president or higher ed exec, and usually someone with early learning experience. Bringing those people together to talk about issues across early learning, pre-K, kindergarten, post-secondary, and workforce makes for a very interesting discussion, because what we bring to the table is the research that we do. Last year in 2019, our staff reviewed over 7,000 bills. And of those 7,000, we actually sat down and analyzed and summarized over 1,500 of those bills. Why is that important? Because when a state calls us and says, we need help on learning loss, we can go to our database and usually pull up 7 or 8 states that already have policies on that so that the education policymakers don't have to recreate the wheel. COVID related in particular, this year in 2020, since March, we have already analyzed over 303 COVID-19 specific education bills. 62 of those bills have already been enacted into law since March 1st, and that happened in 25 states and DC, and there's many more that are on their way. So first thing I want to do is put in a plug for our website, which has a COVID-19 specific update on it. We update every Wednesday. This document, which has continued to grow, has over 375 links to policies states have considered, to rulings that state education agencies have taken, to research that has come out that is all related to this pandemic that we are living in. So I'd urge you to go to the website and look at it across any of the education areas that you are interested in knowing more. So we know that the research shows us that equity is going to be a big issue here. NWEA estimated through some studies that they've done what the learning loss will be. And we know that while COVID-19 affects all of us in the country, there was already an opportunity gap in our country with some children with inequitable access to learning. And if we look at some of the historically underserved student groups, they're probably more likely to get hit with a learning loss than maybe others. Maybe it's because of economic reasons, maybe it's because of lack of broadband services for online schooling. But when we look at the study that NWEA did, and they have years of research on the assessments they've done, they anticipate that 70% of the learning gains in reading will be lost, and that 50% of the learning gains in math because of this impact of the COVID pandemic. And so what we're trying to look at now is what are some of the learning loss policies that states are considering that might be attacking this? So the first thing I want to tell you is most state policies are actually looking at removing barriers to give districts flexibility on how they might make it through the 2020-2021 school year. That's why I say states are in a response mode, not a rebuilding. If they were in a rebuilding, they'd be looking at state policy for the next 3-4 years. A lot of the state policies are looking at flexibility for districts to get things started. I think the rebuilding would start probably 2021 or a little later. There's scarce enacted legislation on learning loss specifically. What we're seeing most of it is in a state policy that is about their general reopening guidelines that they're giving to the districts in their state. And that's where we're seeing a lot of policy around learning loss. But again, we don't even have half the states that have issued so far their general reopening guidelines for their districts that will be opening in August or September. 2 states I'd urge you to look at who have legislation around learning loss, and it's in our website, are really North Carolina and South Carolina. But there's going to be a lot of other changes that are going to be taking place. And one of those is on the slide I have around governance documents. Kentucky is one state that we've looked at a lot and is pretty interesting because they issued 2 very important governance documents that are all around learning loss. The first one is guiding school districts on how they could administer a diagnostic assessment to find out where is that child in the learning loss and what can we do to help them as they start back into summer school or school. Their second guidance that they issued dealt a lot more with curriculum, providing guidance on initial steps for educators on how they can plan and prepare for addressing knowledge gaps due to the extended remote learning. Another state that you might want to consider is North Dakota, which has taken more of a discretionary approach where they're actually suggesting a range of options and policies for states to consider. A lot of it is around extended school days and targeted summer learning opportunities to prepare for the next school year. There's a lot of states that are looking at some of these issues. Arizona, Illinois, and North Carolina are others who have had some governance documents that are really important to look at. We're seeing states take initiative with task forces or advisory councils. And I've used Arizona and Michigan as examples because sometimes politics matters. Not D or R, but we don't always remember that in the K-12 world, about 1/3 of our chief state school officers are elected statewide officials. About 1/3 are actually hired by the governor to be a member of the governor's cabinet. And about 1/3 are actually hired by the State Board of Ed. So Arizona is an example of an elected chief state school officer, Kathy Hoffman, who has actually started a task force for reopening schools, and it's state agency initiated. In Michigan, Governor Whitmer actually took a different approach, and she issued an executive order, and the executive order there is really focused on returning to School Learning Advisory Council and a lot of work that they are going to be discussing around remedial ed for students who've experienced learning loss in both the spring and summer. Another area we're seeing some state policies move is around funding. And so there are different investments of resources for learning loss. Michigan is an example of a state where they have actually allocated $15 million in their budget that's being considered by the legislature right now. That would be specifically for summer school credit recovery and allocations based on COVID-19 impact on communities. The higher a community had been impacted by COVID-19, the more funding they may be able to get from that pot. And that's funding that Michigan has through the United States CARES Act. We're seeing a lot of states that are also starting to look at things differently, like Colorado, and how they will spend their governor's emergency education relief. In Colorado, Governor Polis is dedicating $33 million from that fund to create innovation grants to address learning gaps that widened while schools were closed or doing online learning. We're seeing in a lot of states, Minnesota, Virginia, Texas, Florida, there's a lot of use of the governor's emergency education funds, and the goal that they're using with those is to figure out how they can invest more in learning loss. Florida is an example of one of those states that had a lot of learning loss policy that was highlighted this week when the governor released the new guideline for reopening schools. And lastly, I want to put a couple of quotes out there. Quotes that we're seeing from elected officials and appointed officials who are doing great work. But this is not simple. And to say that we've got a solution for learning loss that's in our pocket and we just need to go implement it is not that easy to do in this pandemic. We have a lot of amazing elected officials who understand that there was an achievement gap and that there are students who didn't have the same opportunity as others. And it's probably been exacerbated because of this pandemic and the switch to online learning. And so I think there's a lot of really important steps that states are taking, but I think we're going to see kind of those unique, innovative ideas coming out of school districts that will have less regulation from the state for this next school year and be thinking more innovatively on how do they help every one of those students to make a difference. Barbara, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. So we're now going to go to discuss the chief state school officers and ask what that organization has been doing. And I know that the Denver Public Schools, where I'm on the board, has been really involved with that organization for quite a while. But to ask Rolf what you all have been doing for planning for restarts in the fall. We've heard that recent research is showing that young learners in pre-K and elementary are probably impacted the most by learning loss, and would love to know what strategies you're seeing for the fall and for restart that could address this.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Next slide, please. And the next one. Yeah, I think this the learning loss is really a major issue that the chiefs are talking about. They meet twice a week on a regular basis with the council to discuss all the various issues. That's done usually on issues that are emerging. And I think I agree with Jeremy that a lot of these emerging issues are still sort of in a recovery mode. And then this table here really shows what kind of huge digital divide we have experienced, because remote learning obviously didn't play out at every place same way. So this table here really shows that 4 out of 10 of the poorest students in the US are accessing remote learning as little as once a week or less. By contrast, for families making more than 100,000 a year, 83% of the kids are doing distance learning every day, with the majority engaged over 2 hours a day. A survey found by a parent advocacy group called Parents Together. I think this is really a huge deficiency that we need to address over the summer. And so I think since March, the council has really done on a continuous basis, engaged the chiefs and the lead staff on what can be done to address remote learning, the continuity of learning for all students, and then meeting the chiefs on some major problem-solving issues. So this phase 1, which is really about remote learning, has now been sort of moved into a second phase, which the council calls restart and recovery. Next slide, please. And we have looked at 4 buckets that are really the big issue in comprehensively looking at how we restart and reopen the schools for next year. First one is continuity of learning. And there I took out some of the learning loss issues and how they can be addressed. We see a number of strategies and approaches that states can take to addressing consistent implementation of remote learning. Work primarily with vulnerable population is high on the agenda, because we have heard from a number of local superintendents that families are no longer be reached. There are housing instability issues. There are food distribution issues. There are a number of impact areas for families that are really attributing to the learning loss that we have seen. The council released a virtual summer school guidance in early May for those states and districts that are interested in providing summer school. And it emphasized what Jeremy has sort of said, a high level and high quality instructional materials and curriculum should be offered during the summer months. A lot of districts have picked up on that and have started to extend their school year, or starting a special summer program for students that I've identified to need the support over the summer. Obviously, there is also summer learning happening with other organizations. So for instance, we work closely with the National Summer Learning Association to really coordinate these efforts of children and students being out there during the summer and gaining some experiences, either in their camps as they may slowly reopen, or have summer school experiences that address their academic needs. Next slide. The conditions of learning is really an area that we have looked at as well. And I think that's also a concern of the chiefs, because some of these areas, the wraparound supports, the school meals, and the access to counseling, childcare, trauma-informed social and emotional learning, are some of these areas that have really emerged and come out and are really impacting not only the business of education, but you know, each and every family that is supporting their students and trying to do that at home. There is an issue that is coming up in the reopening plans that I think needs to really be addressed, that the reopening school also, especially in a hybrid situation where you have some remote learning going on as well as some in-classroom instruction, I think has impact on areas such as childcare or school-age care, because families, maybe some of them going back to work, need that kind of complementary support as the kids go back to school. So these issues are sort of coming up a while. And so the next slide here is about leadership and planning. I mean, Jeremy mentioned that a lot of the states have already released the draft plans. We expect that and anticipate that these plans will be updated as the reopening phases for the entire economy and daily routines are changing over the summer. And so I think most of these states have really started to think about the next phase. There are a couple of examples in how you can have ways in how you start the school year a little early, how you maybe have shifts of students coming into school, a staggered enrollment process. You also have a tendency that you bring the younger students back into school and have all the more independent learners, like in middle and high school, provide some continued remote learning, while the school buildings are being used for the young learners who are more dependent on the instructional routines in the classroom. Next slide. So we have worked with a number of partners, national partners, and also some local district partners on some of these plans. And here is a list of some of the things that resources and toolkits that really cover these topics that I've just mentioned to some extent. The summer learning programming with community groups is something that we're working on right now. There are a number, since camps might be opening slowly, there are a number of opportunities that can be offered to students in extended learning opportunities. In fact, the council last year worked with the National Summer Learning Association on a playbook for chiefs and how to, complement the academic school programs in the summer with the summer learning opportunities for students and the sort of experiential kind of learning that takes place during the summer. And so finally, I wanted to say, this has become clear that addressing the learning during the recovery period must be sort of an all hands on deck kind of effort for schools, community groups, families, and of course the students. And at the local level, to address the learning loss successfully depends on the coordination and collaboration of all the stakeholders. Next slide, please. There are some resources that I wanted to draw your attention to, and that's the virtual summer school guidance documents that's been used, and a number of states have taken the guides and the local school system planning guides to work with local districts to support them in planning and implementing the summer school programs. We also have seen that there are 14 states during the first phase of the recovery that had developed specific guidelines for pre-kindergarten to grade 3 resources that are available for young children. And this is something that I think is very important, because young children obviously learn at sort of a different routines than older and more independent learners. It's also, with remote learning, always an emphasis on the on-screen kind of work that's done with the teachers or with, some of the other support groups within the schools. And for young learners, it's very important that they have a good balance between on-screen and regular home learning with toys, books, and everyday materials. So we feel that a lot has been happening in this area, but the summer loss per se is really still one that needs to be addressed when the students are coming back to school, and for schools to find out what the summer loss actually was for each individual learner. We expect that there's going to be some individual learning plans that are going to be established based on what they find out when the students come back to school, based on some assessments that are being done at the district and the school level. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. So moving now to Alan. Alan, for rural districts and communities, what was the initial response to the pandemic, and what is the restart response going to look like in terms of educating and caring for rural students?
Barbara, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to share what our rural schools are doing. Around March 8th, most of our districts and rural communities were kind of given a jigsaw puzzle. It was kind of thrown on the table, and they basically were given the option to try to put this thing together. And we at the National Rural Education Association, in a partnership with the rural schools community and a grant funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, we were doing I Am a Rural Teacher, and I know those links will be up in the chat. And we started off by sending video crews to highlight what it's like to be a rural teacher and address the shortage of rural teachers across America. We quickly, along with our quickly shifted to COVID and the impact on rural communities. And I wanted to highlight the three kind of different stories and different responses on those. Our first one that I kind of wanted to talk through and kind of talk through their challenges was Grover, Texas, and Grover ISD. It's a district about 500 students, and I think it's near the Panhandle region of Texas. And basically, they went from doing face-to-face regular classroom to really being online, just like everyone else. But the key question that they had was how many students are underprivileged students are connected or have connection to quality Wi-Fi and quality broadband wired connectivity. And they found out soon that they needed to do something in the community, and they had a local internet and Wi-Fi provider give free services to homes that did not have it, and also Wi-Fi spots across their area. And they also, of course, delivered meals to the house or their homes. The biggest thing, I think, looking at that was the shift was about a week process, and from a week to zero to around 80 to 90% of their students being connected, and about 10% doing paper packet and trying to do the best they could to educate. The other is a dramatic difference, which is Damon, Texas, and Damon ISD. It's a K-12 district, about 150, and they had about 90% of their economically disadvantaged students that had zero connectivity, zero device, zero connectivity. So they went from basically delivering home and packets and doing the best they could to provide for their students. What they found is when they were delivering packets and food to the houses and the homes, parents weren't at home because most of the parents were deemed somewhat essential or essential to work, and they had to leave their students at home. So they started a program where they had a cooler drop off. So they put a cooler out front of everyone's home, and they dropped the food in there so the students would be safe and they could provide access. They also graded paper packets to get students ready, and they did it by iPhone or phone. Parents would take pictures and send the assignments in. So very drastic. And then the last one was Corvallis, Montana. It's a district about 1,300, southwest corner of Montana. And they went in a day's time, a Sunday afternoon planning when they knew they were going to be closed on Monday, to going one-to-one across their district and providing hotspots and Wi-Fi to all their students. So they really had the setup to do it ahead of time and really didn't miss a beat. So that kind of gives you the background of the puzzle pieces and how they were putting them together and the basic structure of school. Next slide. So one of the things moving forward in the reopening, especially for rural districts, is that and as Jeremy stated earlier and Rolf as well, there's a lot of response reaction to what is happening and how we're going to reopen. A lot of it kind of plays on the fact that we know we have connectivity issues, but we also know that it has to be an important part. So Kentucky is one of the few states that has a really precise and kind of simple plan to follow, and that's one of the ones that we've highlighted here. And no one going into rural districts and having to plan for this phase of we know we're going to have a rolling stop or a rolling closure, a 14 to 28 day rolling closure moving forward. So those things are really difficult for our rural districts to plan for, especially when you're dealing with connectivity issues. And also what type of plan that they need to come back with and to be a part of to educate their students. I think the biggest thing for our rural communities looking at this is going to be the innovation that comes out of this, the model that they use to educate all their students, and then their community coordination of how they become, I guess, more aligned to the educational process for their students. Obviously, when we look at the reopening strategy for rural districts, is a lot of our districts and a lot of our students travel a long distance on bus. So transportation costs are going to be very at the forefront of their worry and their concern for their budget. And also just the simple structure of school, because it's so important that there's those relationships and those connection with students across, teachers and students across the board. And of course, always we look at equity, and when I was listening to the other presenters talk about the resources and other things, I think about some of the rural remote areas that we serve, that some of those are just not available at this time. So we're hoping that that will expand later on, and obviously looking at how we can our efforts, how we can expand broadband coverage and really have something that we can do for the fall to kind of help with the connectivity issue. Next slide. One of the things that we're trying to do at NREA is make connections and to allow our rural principals to talk to other folks that are kind of going through this challenge. So one of the prospects that came about in 2018, we were part of an International Rural Education Conference, and it was hosted at Bozeman, Montana, at Montana State University, and Dr. Jane Downey helped coordinate that on the U.S. side. We had the opportunity to meet with several folks from the Queensland government, Department of Education, their government schools, and Australia really never closed their schools. They kept their schools open for the most part. And what we're working on, and we'll film in July and have them ready on our website and to post, will be Q&A sessions with rural principals from Kansas and Pennsylvania as they discuss and talk to rural principals in Australia. And I think learning from a lot of the schools not closing, or the schools kind of doing a soft reopening, I think that's going to be good for us to share that information, and we'll have that out in July as well. Next slide, please. I know this looks kind of a little different, this slide, which is okay. This is Chick-fil-A, obviously, but one of the things that we're looking at this from a rural sense is the first drive-through came about in 1921. And we've seen all this innovation and change from this strange looking driving a car through to pick up food. We look at this as a way for rural schools to be innovative. And what's going to come out of this is a forced innovation period of our rural schools. You got to realize many of these school systems went from 0 to a learning management system in 12 days, which is pretty difficult when you're looking at it. It's about a 6-month window for a lot of people, or a year. So we're looking at the innovation changes that are going to come about that are going to kind of evolve and change over time. And we hope that in 5 years we look back and say, hey, why did we ever do the old model? This works really well in educating our students, and we're doing the best we can. So we hope this is one of the positives and the highlights that comes out of this pandemic. My last slide. You know, I wanted to kind of close on my part with it. You know, on our website, NREA.net, we do podcasts, and we talk to local rural leaders. We talk to state chiefs. We talk to legislators in DC and at the state level about the reopening. So check us out on our podcast. We'll do interviews and talk through this and provide resources for our rural districts as we move forward. We're also, as a national organization, we do a national conference every year. We are forced to go virtual this year, so it'll be our first time doing a virtual conference, and a lot of the same challenges that districts are facing, we're facing at the same time. So we're here to support, and thank you for allowing me to present what NREA is doing.
Thanks, Ellen. And you've probably managed to make several hundred people quite hungry right now. So I guess we can thank you for that. That's a mixed blessing. So turning to Valerie, AASA has also done a lot of work in support of rural districts, as well as working with superintendents across the country on addressing issues related to school re-entry. What more can you tell us about the impact on rural communities and the logistical challenges that districts are grappling with as they also focus on learning loss recovery?
Thank you, Barbara. Next slide. I want to thank you all for having me here today. I want to agree with Alan. So much of what we know about rural education, we knew before this pandemic about the vast inequities that occur. You know, one in five children in the public schools in the United States, we have 13,500 plus school districts, and 1 in 5 children in those school districts lives and goes to school in a rural area. If you think about that many children, it is more than the nation's 85 largest school districts combined. I was a principal in a rural area and a superintendent in a rural area. And I can tell you that, as Alan said, the innovation and the creativity that is necessary to address the needs for children when the resources are not as prevalent as they are in some areas is a challenge. But what we love to understand about all education, and particularly rural education, is that this is a difficult time, and we need to pay attention to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs before the Bloom's hierarchy of needs. You all may have heard that recently being said a lot, that the social emotional isolation of children in the rural areas is important. Next slide. One of the things that we are seeing is in a report that we released in 2019, our report looked at the states, ranked the states based on 5 gauges affecting rural education. One of which is how important is rural education in that state? What's the diversity of the rural students? What is the educational policy context in the state? And what are the outcomes happening for those kids? And of course, the college readiness. The college readiness, next slide, is dramatically enhanced when we look at the disparity between students in highest need areas in rural education, of course, in the Carolinas, where I'm from, and other areas of the Deep South and rural Appalachia. So next slide. We knew before the pandemic that our rural students, that there was a significant gap. When we look at things like the AP test, which can be apples to apples comparison, 19% of the high school students compared with 9.5% of rural students scoring well, 3s or better on the AP test, and 18% of urban kids. But look at suburbia. Suburban kids, 24.1% of our students scoring 3s or better on the AP test, and compare that to 9.5% of the kids. We have an opportunity right now with this pandemic. What we're finding is that our superintendents are using incredibly creative strategies to take a look at how do we attend to the social emotional learning needs of the students when they come back to school. And I like to say when we go forward to school as opposed to back, because I hope we don't go back to the way that we have been. This pandemic has highlighted for us the gross inequities that some of our students have access to learning beyond the school day and to high engaging learning during the school day by using digital tools to extend the effectiveness of highly productive teachers and highly effective teachers. We have got to make sure that every single child in this country has access to the internet and has sufficient broadband to learn at high levels. It's a civil rights issue in our time. And we at AASA are really advocating hard for all of our students to have access to high quality learning materials so that they can progress with their peers. Barbara?
Thanks very much, Valerie. I want to now turn the next discussion over to the entire panel. Each of you has mentioned the challenge of inequities before the pandemic and after. And looking at the work that you and your organizations are doing to address intentional recovery plans, intentional ways to improve learning loss, can you talk about what you're working on through the lens of equity for the most vulnerable children? And we'll start, Jeremy, we'll go through in order, but please feel free to ask each other questions.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of equity discussions, especially at the state level. And I think one of the things that some of the state education agencies are having difficulty is they had some good numbers on where there were some achievement gaps, but without having a normal assessment at the end of this school year, those numbers are almost a year old. And so they're looking for new ways to get new assessments and new understanding on where are all of the children so that they can figure out how they can best intervene. I think equity is going to be one of the biggest discussion items we're going to see over this next year, and it should be. I worry that the economic downturn we've had are going to make some important equity programs not be able to get the funding that they might need in order to eliminate some of these problems.
Yeah, and this is Preston. I'll echo some of what Jeremy said, and I'll say here in the state of Louisiana, we're addressing some of those same issues right now. I'm literally in the middle of a state board meeting and stepped out for this webinar. And we're addressing some of the funding challenges that our state is dealing with right now. And I know others have referenced what states are dealing with. Right now, it's all about who can get resources out to communities, to school districts, to the rural communities. And there was already clearly an equity gap that existed, but I think COVID has really highlighted all of those inequities that existed. And I think, frankly, it creates an opportunity for us to, one, look at what we haven't done in the past. So to Valerie's point of, this is a civil rights issue. It's an issue of inequity that's existed for a long time. And states will have to make some important decisions. I know right now in Louisiana, we're debating over how we're going to allocate part of the governor's federal funding and ensuring that as much of that goes to technology, because that's where it's shown up the most in terms of that equity gap. And your presentations really highlighted the difference between the haves and the have-nots and what that means in terms of outcomes for children. And it really comes down to, at the end of the day, like it does with families, with local districts, with states, it comes down to resources in terms of, and there's just such a direct correlation between resources and academic outcomes.
Thank you.
I wanted to respond to the question about the equity too, in terms of the special education population. I think there's been, in the beginning, right in March, significant conversation about how remote learning is impacting students with disabilities. And I think the council has been really in the forefront to work with the Department of Education that those requirements that we have on the IDEA are not going to be waived. I mean, that it's important to find ways in how students with disabilities are being served, supported throughout this situation. And there are a number of innovative ways in how this has been done. That, of course, is some kind of knowledge that we can take into the recovery period for next year to support those students. You know, eventually the department came around and made sure that the students with disabilities would, you know, work, that states would not take the shortcut and go for a waiver. And I think that's sort of really one of the areas where equity has really, I think, been highlighted, and I think it's gotten resolved to some extent.
Thanks. Alan, how about in rural?
Well, I think number one, I think the aspect of we're looking at it as a positive in the sense of it is shining a light on areas that we knew were already issues to begin with. So we're hoping that, and let's just take connectivity as the biggest, one of the biggest, obviously not the biggest one, but we're hoping that that becomes really a thing of the past. And when we come out of this years down the road, that we realize that we're going to have connectivity and students are going to be connected at home. And that's a big part of that. The other part, I think think Preston hit it on the budget. And I think that's what our districts are right now. We're trying to get them as much information as possible on not this fall so much as what's 21 and 22 going to look like for those districts. And we know coming out of 08, 09 and what those second and third year deals on the budget, we're going to make a major impact. And I think that is going to be what we're kind of worried about the most. And I think the programs and the support services and or extra programs for instructional support, they may, we don't want those to go away, but when you're looking at budget issues, those are things that are usually on the table. And that's our biggest fear, I think.
Great, thank you. Valerie.
Thank you, Barbara. We are seeing, I want to make a point that we're not looking at online learning right now. We're looking at crisis learning, crisis home learning. It is not that when we look at online learning, quality online learning, by teachers who know how to teach in that methodology, with students who have sufficient broadband, what we're looking at crisis, even if a family has connectivity, but both parents are working from home and they have 3 kids and only 2 devices, we're having inequities at a very sliding scale. There are students who have none, and I'm so intrigued, Alan, with the superintendent who thought of putting coolers on the porch and putting the food in it. I did not, that's an awesome story. But if you look at Rolf's slide, where poor children are being able to learn online, engaging 1 time per week or less, and 83% of students of means are on every single day, we're going to see a tremendous gap. Our executive director, Dan Dominich, seated a task force of superintendents. We are on small, I think we're zoomed out. Ever since March, we've been doing a lot of webinars and teaching and learning with our superintendent colleagues, hundreds and hundreds of folks. So what Dan did was seated a task force to look at what are the key guiding principles of going back to school. One of the key ones that's come out, the number one, is the need for parallel planning, multiple reopening scenarios and contingencies, because we do see, if we follow the trends and the projections, that we are probably going to have a second wave, that we are not out of the first wave yet. And when that happens, how do we build responses to not plunge our students back into even more acute learning loss than they already are? How do we make sure that they connect with their teachers and that they have that relationship as fast as possible, so if we have another wave in the fall, that we're able to be prepared for it? That we've heard everything from folks, as Rolf was mentioning, possibly looking at AB schedules, morning schedules, night schedules, vacating the high schools and spreading all of the elementary kids out for social distancing. How do you manage buses to get kids when you can only have 6 or 8? There's millions of different details that we are seeing. But what we're focusing on, helping our superintendents are emphasizing, is understanding that our students have been traumatized by this immediate plunge into isolation, or at least remote relationships, and attending to the care of our children, making sure that we're having personalized and differentiated professional learning for the adults. Many of our teachers are saying, I'm afraid of going back. I don't feel comfortable going back, and I don't feel like I have the skills to teach online all the time. Transforming the teaching and learning and assessment process to ensure that we have personalization and differentiation for children, and to look at what are those strategies. We've had a series of webinars at aasa.org. Folks can go see and look at, ever since March, there's been 2 to 3 per week on strategies by practitioners of what they're looking at for moving forward to school.
Thank you. Thank you. Preston has a state board conflict and will have to leave before the question and answer session starts. So Preston, I'd love to hear from you, your overall reactions to what you heard in this webinar, and then to tell us a bit about the plans that Louisiana the plans they're making to be able to be ready in the fall.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the panelists. This has been absolutely wonderful. Hearing all the information that you've shared has been helpful for me, but it also highlights the fact that we're all in this together and that many of us are experiencing a lot of the same challenges all across the country, because what I've heard from all of the states is a lot of what we're experiencing here in Louisiana. I will say that we've got two extremes, right? But that we have to sort of marry together, because I agree, we're in the middle of a crisis. And so we're managing the crisis, and we've got crisis learning on one hand, that we have to manage our way through all of this. But I think the Chick-fil-A slide, and we're giving a lot of press to Chick-fil-A today. And so, Alan, I hope you're getting some royalties off of that slide there. But I will tell you that it's fabulous, because it really does highlight the fact that in the middle of a crisis, it creates opportunities for innovation and for us to learn from some of the challenges. And one, I'll just tell you, and I hate to confess this amidst 100 people or so, or hundreds of people on this webinar, but in some respects, I've kind of enjoyed, I really apologize for admitting this, but I've enjoyed the staying at home in the crisis, because I really have in some ways been so much more efficient and effective because I've been at home working. And that seems like a strange thing to say, and I know it doesn't apply to everyone, but what that said to me is there are opportunities to learn, to build from this crisis. So I think that we can't miss out on this opportunity to develop better models, perhaps better models in terms of how do we fund our schools across our states? How do we create new academic models? Should we change our school year? Should we go away from the agrarian calendar that we had? Should we modify it in some way? Should we take advantage of the fact that with the fact that we're being forced to use technology, and these are the conversations we're having in Louisiana, should we be looking at ways to deliver education in a different way? You know, this morning in our committee meetings with our State Board of Education, we're looking at how do we get retired teachers back into the classroom because there's such a shortage, and particularly in certain areas like math and science. Is there a way to get some master teacher, for example, that you can't get into those rural areas and maybe into some of those urban areas, but by using technology, can we leverage that resource to deliver education in a different way that might be more effective? So on one hand, absolutely we're dealing with the crisis of COVID, but it also is presenting to us some opportunities. But on the ground, where we have to actually implement these policies and great thoughts. So the Department of Education sometimes cringes when I'll say these sorts of things, because they say, you're a board member and it's easy to sort of pontificate and talk about vision and mission, but we actually have to implement these sorts of things. And that sort of came to head earlier today when we started talking about allocation of resources. So in terms of, you know, how do we now fund this gap in terms of technology? And making sure that those of you who are advocates really use your voice to impress upon the policymakers, those state elected officials, to make sure that those resources go where they should. And why is that important? So the governor of the state of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, has an opportunity to take his $50 million and allocate about $30 million toward technology to shrink that digital divide that exists. Our governor 10 years ago, on the other hand, had an opportunity to do the exact same thing. We had an opportunity to really expand broadband access to rural areas, to areas across the state. And that governor made a decision not to take federal money that really could have prevented a lot of the challenges that we're experiencing now. So I say this because as we're living in this moment in history, it's important for us to recognize that those policies that we enact, that we pass, are so important for generations to come. In fact, they're important for the next 2 months, next 3 months, and it's critical. I will put in a plug, and it's been referenced a couple of times, and if you go to louisianabelieves.com, I think that our team at the Louisiana Department of Education has done a really good job in terms of laying out a plan. And it's obviously very, very fluid. It's changing day by day. It offers some guidance. It's not at all a mandate, because it's difficult to do that when you've got rural areas, urban areas, a lot of haves and have-nots, and we have to navigate through that. But offering as much guidance as we possibly can is critical, but also hearing back from local districts, local communities, local schools, what they're experiencing and sharing those best practices and maybe not so best practices. So one of the things that we've done very, very well, I think, and hopefully we'll continue to do, is try to share as much information so that our leaders, our schools, our districts are sharing information and learning from one another. So for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, I applaud you for holding this webinar, because information is so critical, and the more that we can share it and empower those who are in positions to impact our children, to make to help our students and our leaders become better, is critical. And that communication, the information that you're sharing, I think is extraordinarily critical. And again, I applaud you for having all of us, but more importantly, being forward thinking and getting this information out.
Thank you.
Now, Barbara, I will have to jump off and head to this meeting, but thank you again, everyone, for having me.
Thank you very much. And Emily is now going to take over and manage the Q&A portion of this.
Thank you. And I'll just say thank you to Preston. He literally squeezed us in between committee meetings and board meetings. So we're really, really grateful to have your, well, everybody's, but Preston, I know you have to run off. So thank you so much for being with us. And we look forward to ongoing collaboration.
Thank you, Emily.
So thank you. So if you haven't yet, please post your question. I know there's been a few questions that have come through on the chat. It's helpful for us to have them actually in the Q&A so we can kind of manage this. So the first question that came in, and which I think is a great question for all of our speakers, and I will say, I know that Yoli Flores, our Chief Program Officer, actually already posted in the chat that we just had a webinar on the same topic. But the question is, are any of the communities represented today, are any of you doing innovative family engagement activities? And I actually will also post, I know Preston just had to leave, but I know that Louisiana Department of Education has great resources around for parents. So the question is stating that many of our families do not have access to internet or computers, so virtual and online resources are not available. So just wanted to hear from all of you about this idea of family engagement and what's being done and what are you learning from your members, from states, from superintendents about family engagement.
Can maybe start with this. We are just about ready to come out with a resource and guidance document on family engagement. We're working with another number of national partners on this, and we really feel that the family engagement really can be seen maybe through 3 lenses right now. First of all, I think there are the highly impacted families that have experienced a setback in a number of ways and may not be living anymore in the school district that they had just a few months ago. So I think there are a number of school districts that are trying to identify where the families are and how they can bring them back. The second one has to do with relationship building, the area that is so critical when the students come back. A lot of the districts and the state chiefs have talked about, should we have some kind of looping concept back in our schools, where the teacher who had a relationship with the student last year would be the teacher of record for the student in the upcoming year. There's a lot of discussion around those things, because I think it's very important that the families and the students, continue a relationship they already had. And the third area really has to do with the digital divide. I think this is something just heard from Alan, and what the rural districts were able to accomplish, I think is happening all across the country. But the summer months are really an opportunity for addressing this connectivity issue to a greater extent. I mean, the council is working on ways and how that can be done, with the CIOs working with the local communities and establishing that kind of setup for the new year so that we don't have that digital divide. I think this is a critical issue. And Valerie mentioned that there might be another wave coming. Of course, we've been discussing this, and if that's happening, then of course we're back to where we were just a few months ago, with just exclusive remote learning for our students. So family engagement really is a critical aspect I also feel that family engagement is going to be redefined after this experience. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Rolf. We have a sort of similar question, and I think Alan actually gave a response in the Q&A, but good to hear from everybody. You talked a little bit about this idea of A and B schedules in the fall, and I'm just wondering if you can share about any conversations about what this means for teachers who have children, and how will parents be able to work, how will teachers who have children be able to work. So any reaction, any comments around that would be great.
Well, I mean, I'll start off if it's okay.
Sure.
I think you know, a lot of rural districts were on a 4-day week or doing a modified schedule to begin with before the pandemic. So sometimes they dealt with the issues of parents having to have some type of child support or other activities or services. So I'm not saying that's the answer, obviously, but I think schools are going to have to come up with ways to kind of support the family and to work those rotations out that would support the family, especially with bus transportation and or school housing those students during certain time periods. I think there's districts, I know I'm located in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and there's districts in East Tennessee that are looking at their multi-tiered support system, their help, and you're looking at those modified schedules where trying to catch students up, but those modified schedules with students would be coming in not 5 days a week, but maybe 4 days a week, and doing the rotation, but also keeping in mind the different aspects of family and helping out the community.
This is Valerie. We've heard a lot of discussion as we've visited with different superintendents about different models, such as alternating A-B days. And some folks have looked at morning and afternoon. And the hard part about all of that is if you have kids in multiple schools, how to do it. And to try to figure out a way to match it with families. We've heard of a lot of extensive surveys that have gone out to parents to say, what's your schedule like? Or do you have a parent working from home in the go forward? Might you be interested in having a student who learns in home as opposed to coming back to school? Many parents have said that if you have schooling without social distancing, without having some of the CDC guidelines in place, my kid's not coming. And so who are those families who have that opportunity to say that? They're usually folks who are still employed, and we know that 1 out of 5 Americans are not currently employed. So we've got a lot of that going on. And how do we build in contingency plans? Most districts are looking at hybrid, where there's not one size fits all, that you're going to have to customize the schooling based on what the families need, because we've got to try to get parents back to work, but at the same time to make sure that the children are safe. There are all kinds of issues around how do nurses check folks for temperatures, and if you do come to school with a temperature, you present off of a bus with a temperature, what do you do with the other kids who just came in with you on that bus? And all that flipping around is quite interesting. We've heard a lot of conversation about how do teachers teach with masks on, particularly if we're trying to teach reading. Mm-hmm. And students need to be able to see the mouth in order to be able to learn their sounds. How do you do that? And is there enough protective personal gear for all of the students and the parents to have what they need? So it is extremely complex. And all I could say is right now, folks are making parallel plans and saying, this is our plan as of today. As of what we know right now, this is what we can tell you that we're hoping and planning to be able to do. In the southern states, the middle of June is, for all intents and purposes, 6 weeks away from school starting back. And there's some school districts are just getting out. But there's a whole lot of decision-making that has to take place really, really fast. And the biggest, not just educating our kids, teaching our kids, but it's also feeding our kids. How do we have cafeterias with social distancing? Many school districts are talking about having food delivered to the classroom, but then there becomes a problem of who do we have that can do that? So there's all kinds of multi-dimensional uncertainties at this point.
Thank you to all of you. So this next question is thinking about New York and Boston in particular, but you've all touched on this a little bit. I think it's an issue across the board. So, you know, when transportation is a major issue, when there is no in-person, face-to-face summer school happening, they really feel like there's no possibility of returning. And so the question is sort of like, how are you all thinking, you and your members thinking about this impact and the sort of that learning loss recovery that's needed, and how do you see these areas where there's really like multiple levels of barriers recovering? That's a hard one.
I'm just curious about the question, why Boston and New York?
This person just says that the area was hit hard,
Okay.
particularly hard, high numbers.
Okay.
Yeah. Any thoughts there, Valerie?
No.
I think we've seen statewide in some areas, though. I mean, this is really hard on the transportation side. I mean, we hear districts that are starting to have a conversation on how do we use busing to get kids to different schools and maintain social distancing. I mean, New York, Boston, DC, you can name other cities. Public transportation is a major part for a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers for getting to where they need to be. And so there are issues that we don't have answers to yet. And I don't know, and the question alludes to it, if they will by August when things are supposed to start back up.
Thank you. And I'll say also elementary school. I used to ride the bus with a fourth grader in DC. So that's a really big deal. So another question here, which Alan already provided a great answer to, but love to hear from more of you about ideas around public-private partnerships or policies that any of you are seeing to permanently increase connectivity for schools.
I'll mention in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, where I most recently served in the area of technology and transformation, there's some really fascinating public-private partnerships that have occurred. There's an organization called Eliminate the Digital Divide that one of our students presented several years back, and we went to galvanize her idea. Her name is Franny Millen, and her idea was to ask all of our businesses to give the used laptops to a group of students to refurbish, and then we repurposed them into homes. So we galvanized our whole technology community and have developed that, and it is going gangbusters. And that's an example of one man's trash is another man's treasure. And so we were able to refurbish, and the students who were refurbishing those computers have been taught the skills that they can now translate into jobs, which is really pretty cool. And we got a large number of our partners to help us refurbish. We call them learning cottages. They would otherwise be known as portable classrooms that might not be used as much, and refurbish those had businesses equip them as refurbishment centers with security and other things to protect the devices. But we've seen a lot of internet service providers come forward and say, how can we help? There's the Sprint 1 Million program, there's the Verizon Innovative Learning Schools program, AT&T has programs, and others. And I think that if every single internet service provider stepped up and said, what can we do? This pandemic has shown us that we have got to deal with our inequities in our country, or we're going to exacerbate not just the digital divide, but the divide. And to see if we can't, all of us come together to say, not on our watch, we need to make sure that every child has opportunities and the inequities, because there's so much we can do to reach them in the home. It's been fascinating to me to see how far we can grow students with remote learning and quality remote learning.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to mention the Verizon Innovative Learning School, Innovative Learning Schools, and then Digital Promise, which is a campaign for grade level reading partner. They have a lot of good resources there too. So we have this other great question from a statewide AmeriCorps tutoring program in Minnesota, focusing on reading and math. So what are your thoughts on how community partners can best support schools and looking ahead to the new school year? And you know, I was also going to mention during Valerie's comments about public libraries being a resource for connectivity. You know, I know that they have been restricted with what they can do as well, but I feel like that's a good source. But I'd love to hear from all of you in response to this question around that sort of how can community partners be tapped and leveraged and collaborated with to as we think about going back to school? Or any examples you may have.
Emily, again, on libraries, thank you for reminding me to mention that. In Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, we copied the New York City model a couple of years back, wherein the student's ID card is also, ID number for the school is also the library card. And it's amazing how many resources are available to kids at home. And PBS, well, I saw that we had a member of PBS team in our audience today. They have amazing resources. As long as students have a way to connect to the classroom beyond the bricks and mortar classroom, we can continue to learn and grow.
Any more thoughts on community partners? I thought I heard maybe someone was about to comment. No.
Yeah, we've heard from a number of chiefs that they've really sort of reached out to get a better handle on these wraparound services that are going to be needed in the beginning, August and September, especially when the students come back. There may be a need to have specific counseling sessions in place, how to re-enter. I think it has to do with the anxiety of being back in an environment that's not totally cleared of any kind of health or safety issues. And I mean, the sanitation and the cleaning aspect is one thing that is going to just burden the teachers and the staff in the schools. But for students to see this every day and to become aware of just every moment that could potentially have be cause for an infection, I think is going to be real. And so families are going to just act in the best interest for their students. And that is going to, we don't know how this is going to play out, but the support services, the wraparound services are going to be critical to have in place.
And building on that, a similar question, but thinking particularly about volunteers. I mean, we had the question from the AmeriCorps program, but just thinking about community volunteers and especially retirees who want to volunteer. Any talk among your members about how volunteers might be tapped as we think about returning to school?
I mean, I think districts especially rural districts, are already a big part of the community. And I think the community coordination on the reopening is going to be vital to have those volunteers to help. I think your faith-based organizations or any other community established programs that can help out are going to be really needed. I also think there's going to be an opportunity for the business sector to be flexible on their scheduling to help out schools and vice versa. So I think Jeremy mentioned it earlier, how we change our total education schedule. In 5 years, it may not look anything like we're doing now. I think that this is going to give the ability to, we've shown that we can work from home, we can remote learn somewhat, not always great, but we're getting better and we're going to get better. So I think those things are going to change and to kind of adjust it forward. So.
And
yeah,
again,
following on that, Alan, I just say, we saw this with technology in a lot of states. I mean, school districts who had hundreds of laptops that were used between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., but never allowed to be checked out to the students. And when schools started to shut down, they checked those laptops out for months on end. And so I think we are going to see a dramatic change in how we're using services and where those services are being provided. That's not going to solve the digital divide, but it's a step towards, making sure that we get everyone the services that we should have been maybe providing earlier, but we were worried about doing so because of liabilities.
And sort of another sort of angle on the same question is thinking about after school programs and thinking about how a lot of those after school programs, if they can, are continuing to be in communication with their students, with their participants, and in some cases going virtual with their after school programs. So any ideas about opportunities to kind of stay connected and make sure that students still have opportunities to these after school or online learning that's provided through after school programs?
If you have an A-B schedule, then you need school-age care. If school-age care was provided in the school, it's most likely going to be provided in the school anymore because the space is going to be needed for students coming back in. Because of social distancing, obviously you have smaller class size and you need more rooms. So we've seen this in Head Start and childcare programs across the country that are now looking for other facilities. I think there's going to be a reduction that may play out in rural areas. It might be particularly hard, not for families not having access to school-age care. And because programs may no longer be in business by the time we come back. So this is an issue that's not necessarily an education issue, but it's an issue that we all need to be aware of because it's a community-related aspect that is a critical piece in the puzzle, if you will, for making this work, this reopening. And the county executives, the county councils, the city councils, all of those really need to be part of this effort, not just the school district administrators. It is going to have to be a community effort.
Thank you. And this is a really good question that you're probably in conversation with already about how are you going to track attendance, especially if it's either 100% virtual or hybrid. What are folks talking about attendance? And then, the sort of second part of that question is, they've already shown inconsistent participation in online learning, what are the strategies to make sure that more students remain engaged, even if they're not in the same room as the teacher and their classmates are in the same virtual room?
Most of what we've heard about attendance for now during this shutdown is that there's so many kids unaccounted for. Sometimes 10-15% of the students have not even logged in a single time. They may have moved, their parents may have lost their jobs, or they might be just not able to connect and they're not doing their assignments. We don't know where what are those superintendents are mostly saying, we don't know. We're reaching out, having folks go to homes. Some of the folks are using mail to send packets to students and then have the parents, as Alan shared a moment ago, take pictures and send it in. We're seeing a lot of that. Going into the fall, that's a big concern because of course schools, right now we are in crisis mode as a country still, but as we go into the fall, I'm sure that states that fund based on pupil membership are going to expect us to be able to count the kids wherever they are, and that's going to be a big challenge. One of the things that has been discussed is as we're looking at attendance regionally, so if you have a city school district and a county school district working together to see where could those families have gone, because there will be a lot of displacement as some parents decide to not send their kids back, or they might go to live someplace, they might be sheltering in place somewhere else. So having specific strategies, it's in all of the plans, and I've been so impressed, Jeremy and Rolf, at both ECS and the CCSSO. The chiefs and the governors have really stepped up during this time, by and large across our country, and they've been helpers and decision makers. And I think that that's one of the things that our superintendents are going to be asking for help with is cross-district lines. Where did this student or that student go? Which also could drive a conversation that we should be having as a nation anyway, which is a distinct, unique identifier number for every child.
Thank you. That's, quite complex. And we have a couple more questions, but I also wanted to say that we are going to post a poll for all participants. If you could give us your take 2 minutes to complete our quick survey to give us your feedback on today's session. So another question here, and Rolf, I expect that you have some insight on this. What's the planning that school districts are doing with childcare and youth development organizations that currently are providing childcare to manage alternative schedules and to allow parents to work? We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but any more thoughts there?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting situation because it seems that the reopening of childcare as a result of having essential personnel having access to care for the children has sort of given the schools some pointers in terms of how you can manage smaller groups of kids within a certain facility, within a certain place. Most of the states that we have tracked have started to reopen their childcare facilities now to those families that are not in this essential personnel category. So this is done very gingerly right now, because obviously it's the same situation that we will have in a few months with schools. It's as families having to sort of navigate this and finding a way to have enough trust in the program that everything's going to be taken care of in terms of sanitation and hygiene. And so I think that's sort of the plans are right now to figure out what a good number would be in those facilities in terms of number of children. We have seen states that hold on to no more than 10 children within a classroom, preschool classroom, or an early childhood place. And then some states that have moved it up to 15. There is no magic number about this, but I think it has more to do with the overall environment of health and safety that's going to be created when families bring their kids back. The children, however, will do whatever they have been doing all along. So they won't be moving the materials. They are going to just, hug each other. They're going to be, and that is going to be another element that I think teachers have to get used to, is to how keep the kids apart. I mean, it seems odd, but that's sort of the situation we're in.
And then it's a sort of a follow-up question from a different participant, but what do you see as the most effective ways to bolster learning for pre-K, nursery school, Head Start, especially with their unique needs for parent engagement in light of so many disparities and pressures for parents? So what's top of mind? What are you thinking in terms of like, what are the sort of most effective ways to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so in our circles, we have this discussion about just how you, continue some pre-K quality programming, if you will, throughout the recovery periods. And so I think aside from the facilities itself, I think getting back to using high quality materials in the classrooms, if the children can come back to the sites, that's of course an area. But if the children decide to stay home, or the parents decide that the children should stay home, I think home visiting programs might be a first entree into getting kids back into a school situation. So that might be more, first of all, control might be an alternative that schools or programs can offer, Head Start included, that can offer for the first few months until we have a better sense in how things are going to develop overall with the pandemic. And the rest are all the practices that we're familiar with that have been out there before. And it's just that one aspect that's different is the fact in how social distancing can be practiced with younger kids. That's still and how teachers will, get them to that point to realize that. So that is one of the issues that needs to be worked out.
This is an interesting question. I don't know if any of you have been in, oh, sorry, Barbara.
Can I just add on to what Rolf?
Yeah, of course.
We've been doing a lot of surveying of parents and teachers of preschool through third, as I know a lot of districts have, but our most requested support from parents has been coaching on how to apply classroom management techniques to home learning. Trying to get your kids who just want to jump up and run around the table to pay attention to an activity kind of the way a skilled teacher can do all the time. So that was the request from parents. We're not really talking about high schoolers so much today, but the most requested support from our high schoolers was for mental health consultations. So I think one opportunity is the data that's going to be available from all this online interaction, and to try and understand at a more nuanced level who needs what kind of thing when, and kind of the dosage, to me is an opportunity that's going to come out of all this remote teaching and learning that we're going through.
Thank you. So the other question here is about private schools. Have you all been in touch with private schools? If there's different rules for returning to school, boarding schools, anything you're hearing about independent schools? I had a feeling that we have all the folks focused on, you know, state commissioners and superintendents, and so maybe have no thoughts, but that's a good question. I think that that's probably, you know, all across the board, right? So, okay.
We did cover it for the younger kids, of course, because most of the younger children, you know, under 5 are in some kind of private settings, right, and private schools. In terms of the other private schools, there are a number of issues as to how the funding is being funneled from the district to providing services children in private schools. So that's one issue that the council is dealing with right now.
So I think we are running up on about 2 minutes. I know I just want to read this one comment about after school programs, that finding ways to provide after school and before school opportunities to help children catch up and keep up and allow parents to work enough hours to pay their family bills is very much an education issue. If schools don't have space, then how can schools step up to build partnerships with community faith-based and employers to provide these essential opportunities for children and families? So I think that was more of a sort of a comment, just sort of making sure, and I know you've all talked about how important the wraparound services are, how important community partners are, how important collaboration and kind of making sure we're all in this together. And apologies if you did ask a question. I know there was a question about budgets, which I feel like it's a whole webinar in and of itself. So we'll have to take that up another time. So we wanted to just wrap up, and I'm going to say a huge, enormous thanks to all of our just highly, highly esteemed presenters today. Thank you, Barbara O'Brien, for the excellent moderation and for your participation today too. Thank you to all of our participants today. This has been an excellent, excellent webinar. As you can see, we have several upcoming webinars that we hope that you'll participate in. They're every Tuesday. That's our Learning Tuesdays. And we have an exciting one next week on keeping the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge going, bridging the early years and early grades. And then in July, we're going to shift into having our partners present their information. And so the National Summer Learning Association has National Summer Learning Week, and they'll be presenting on July 7th. So please stay tuned for that. And I think we do need to wrap up. We're right at 4:30 Eastern time. So thank you again to all of our panelists, and have a great afternoon.